ladies and gentlemen. I'll get started now so that we can give Michael and Jennifer as much time to present their papers as possible. We're in the presence of two outstanding senior scholars at Wayne State University who are in the middle of their careers and with much behind them in terms of the quality of their scholarship and much ahead of them in terms of what else they can contribute to the academic reputation of our university. Jennifer Hart is an associate professor in history and affiliate faculty of anthropology. I'm also admitting people as we go in. Her first book, entitled Ghana on the Go, African Mobility in the Age of Motor Transportation, was a finalist in the Herseth-Korkowitz Prize of the African Studies Association. Her book chapters and journal articles across a range of interdisciplinary fields engage themes of technology, infrastructure, mobility, and urban space. Her most recent article in the journal Technology and Culture was the recipient of the Bowen Wilkes Prize of the Ghana Studies Association. An active public scholar, her work has been published in the Washington Post, the Conversation, Africa is a Country, and Nursing Clio. She collaborates on the Instagram embedded art project, This Trotro Life, writes on her own blog, GhanaOnTheGo.com, and directs the digital humanities project, Accra Wala. Michael Fuhlhage
Fuhlhage
is an associate professor in the Department of Communication. His book is Yankee Reporters and Southern Secrets, Journalism, Open Source Intelligence, and the Coming of the Civil War. The American Journalism Historians Association awarded him the Award for Excellence in Teaching, which honors a college or university teacher who excels at teaching in the area of journalism and mass communication history, makes a positive impact on student learning, and offers an outstanding example for other educators. His research, both solo and with graduate students, explores the development of the practice and products of 19th century journalism and engages topics that include reporting as a form of intelligence gathering, journalism as an act of resistance in the anti-slavery and abolition movements, and the prehistory of stereotypes about Mexican Americans in the 19th century press. He's also a recent occupant of the Humanities Center's suite as a resident scholar, and I remember his contribution with great warmth. I was sorry that he didn't come for a second term. He was always an engaging scholar. And Jennifer has been a friend of the Humanities Center for years. She and I and a group of scholars attended a meeting of the Consortium for Humanities Centers and Institutes. And there I learned that she had made many friends across the world in the humanities area. And she continues to be an important voice to support the humanities on this campus, particularly digital humanities. So I'm very happy to welcome Michael and Jennifer to give their talk today, which is entitled Infusing Historical Consciousness into the News, Bringing the Lessons of the Past into Public. So please welcome to the virtual podium these two outstanding young scholars.
Thank you so much, Walter. And we're delighted to be here, and thanks to everybody for joining us. we're going to share some information. We're going to talk about the kinds of things that might be possible in the realm of what we're interested in, and the kind of projects that we've proposed, and then we're going to open it up to you for questions and thoughts and suggestions, because this is an ongoing interest and project, and we're hoping to actually be able to realize it. We wanted to start off by talking about some of the inspiration to talk about what the project is, and some of the inspiration for the project and where it comes from. The idea, and we had proposed a Humanities Center working group last year to try to create a history journalism workshop that would connect historians broadly construed on campus, scholars of history, with area journalists, and to come up with some models for good kind of relationship and collaboration, to identify some key issues related to the use of history in journalism and vice versa, and to come to some mutual understanding about what this relationship might look like, because it's expanding all the time, right? We see historians working in and writing in the public sphere in rapidly increasing numbers, and so and increasing interest in history in the kind of realm of journalism. So we our proposal was to kind of work on this project and try to make it happen, and then COVID happened, right? So that kind of put a damper on the plans, and of course you can make it virtual and try to work through it, but I think that at a time when everybody's exhausted, working through difficult or potentially difficult and controversial topics is maybe not the best time. So it's a little bit on a hiatus, but it gave us an opportunity to think through what this looks like. And the inspiration for this project comes from the LePage Center at Villanova University, which was at the time run by a man named Jason Steinhauer. And Jason kind of founded a new subfield of history called history communication, and that field was dedicated to training historians to translate historical research for the general public in a wide range of spheres, right? But understanding that work is really important, and that the input of professional historians or people who've been trained as historians doing that work or having input in that process was also really important. And so they developed a relationship with the Philadelphia Inquirer and ran a workshop with the staff of the Philadelphia Inquirer, thinking about trying to build this explicit relationship between the LePage Center and its affiliated scholars and the Inquirer, the staff and writers of the Inquirer, and its editorial board and editors. And so there's some interesting things they learned as a result of that project. Editorial oversight is real, and editors are keen to control what goes in their papers. And there's that produces some challenges sometimes in building relationships and putting and creating stories and putting stuff in the paper. And there's some other related challenges too, which I'm happy to talk about. But that idea kind of inspired us to think about this further, and to work toward a model here at Wayne where we're being encouraged, right, to write in the public more. And at a moment when historians in particular, scholars of all sorts, but certainly historians, have been called on a lot to comment on public affairs and provide important context for contemporary issues. And, we're often not trained to do that. And journalists often aren't trained to be historians. And so, thinking about, what we might be able to build, learning from the lessons of the LePage Center and some other examples across the country to kind of help support that effort, right? And this is part of course, a larger kind of commitment to public scholarship that, so if we can do it first with historians, since there's this model, then we can expand potentially, right? And think about how Wayne State maybe can and should work with area journalists, and how we might be able to organize that interaction, and provide support for that interaction in order to advance public scholarship, not just in Detroit papers, but around the world. And so that's kind of where we are. I think Michael's going to spend some time, because we then went to the American Journalism History Association and thought about that. So Michael, do you want to share some of that?
Absolutely. And let me see if I can get our screen share to work. I'm assuming that I've got privileges to do that. And yes, it appears that I do. So this is going to be nice and smooth. Okay. So here we go. And yeah, I see him on my last slide here. So are you all able to see this slide that says "One River, Many Stories"?
And yes.
Okay, very good. And am I positioned with that in a way that you can see the whole slide? That's the other thing. I'm a little confused about how all the things in the Zoom screen overlap.
I can see it. I also see your interface with the PowerPoint, which is fine for me.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, it looks a little bit better.
I'm just gonna, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So, so as a first step for our working groups project, we convened a panel about engaging in public history and journalism collaboration at the American Journalism Historians Association. So what I did last spring was I just put out a call on the AJHA group on Facebook, generally describing the project and asking if anybody felt compelled to join in a panel proposal like this. And I had a couple of very great colleagues from AJHA who came on board with that. Dr. Hart also was part of that, and she suggested that we bring in Dr. Carly Goodman, who does the editing for a Washington Post project called Made by History. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that panel covered. And first, this pertains to the slide that you have on the screen right now, was Dr. Jennifer Moore of the Department of Communication at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. And she discussed how she and her colleague, John Hatcher, used engaged journalism to uncover stories from the past. She used a methodology that public health communication researchers call community engagement strategies. And what this was designed to do was to disrupt relationships between news organizations and their audiences, so that the people portrayed in news stories would go from being the observed to being observers and collaborators themselves. Over 2 years, actually, this was an 18-month grant that they received from the Knight Foundation. They convened gatherings with people who had lived along the St. Louis River. This is southwest of Duluth in Minnesota. And they also invited members of the news media who cover that area to join in these collaborations as well. So these were community forums. They were conversations, in public meeting halls and so forth. And what they attracted was a group that included people from newspapers, TV and radio stations, bloggers, photographers, videographers, scholars at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, college and high school journalism programs, and citizen storytellers. So citizen storyteller is the term that we use when we take someone who otherwise might be just portrayed in a news story. And we go to them, and instead of just using them as a human source to ask interview questions of and then publish what they had to say, they become the observers, and they become the interviewers, and they become the gatherers of information and the presenters of information. So a citizen journalist in their own right. And Dr. Moore also invited them to publish news articles and documentaries and podcasts and other media that tell stories somehow related to the St. Louis River. And the goal was to produce a diverse collection of stories, to engage citizens and invite them to tell their own stories and to build community among the region's professional educators and citizen storytellers and professional journalists as well. The project was informed by scholarship on the changing role of journalists as facilitators rather than gatekeepers of public discourse. And it did produce hundreds of stories in traditional legacy media, such as local newspapers and commercial TV and radio stations, as well as on blogs and micro news sites and school newspapers and public broadcasting stations. Ultimately, they found that traditional news media were very resistant to the disruption that they had set out to create. So longstanding newspapers and broadcast stations deviated little from their established journalism routines. They would sort of embrace it as long as it furthered their own news organization's goals. But you know, once they lacked the I guess the creative animus that came from Dr. Moore and Professor Hatcher, they sort of, you know, backslid into their old ways. And, you know, change is a difficult thing to do within stubborn organizations. So the effect, though, was they still got a lot of citizen participation, and that participation was diverse and it was expansive. And the effect was to give a lot of residents a voice, but not very much amplification through traditional news channels. So what this is an example of a journalism historian, as well as a journalism practitioner, leading an intervention in order to foster new ways of envisioning creativity and audience engagement and community storytelling. And by building their project around the St. Louis River, which is a feature that is central to the region's identity, they attracted participants from outside traditional news media to pursue a common goal. And that was to allow anyone to tell a story and communicate information about this river that is central to recreation and community identity in their area. Now, I'm quoting now from Jennifer Moore's study on the project. She had this published in Journalism Studies about a year and a half ago. One participant articulated her observations about the project's capacity to bring groups together. With the river at the center, a diverse group of people could dialogue about personal, familial, recreational, political, environmental, historical, and economic issues. So Dr. Moore's approach in Duluth raises some intriguing possibilities for engaging community stakeholders in telling stories about their places and their interests and their concerns with mainstream media as a facilitator. So when, you know, I'm a scholar who's grounded in mass communication and communication studies. And I always run back to the model of the communication circuit. And, you know, the original incarnation of that is you have someone who formulates a message, they send that message through channels. So that's your media, right? And they are received by someone who decodes that information. In the old formulation of that was sort of like a hypodermic needle. We take information, we inject it into someone's arm, and that becomes part of them. The old model didn't take into account that people would interpret information based on their own lived experiences and what their environments were. You know, it really foregrounded the media makers of news rather than privileging the recipients of that information and the audience as people who had interpretive powers and could push back and send back feedback in their own right. What Dr. Moore did was sort of turn that hypodermic needle model on its head. And I think that this offers some possibilities for any collaboration that we do here in Detroit. So in addition to collaborating with local news media, to also convene gatherings with community stakeholders to find out, all right, so what are the issues that are most important to you that have been covered in local media, and which issues do you think are overlooked? And that can help to create a concept map of news topics that people are hungry to hear more about, and that they want to know more about the deep background and history of. Well, what can help to guide this kind of project also was covered in another presentation by another of our panelists, and that was Dr. Candy Carter-Olson, who's an associate professor of communication at Utah State University. Dr. Olson's teaching is guided by media cultivation theory, which tells us that stereotypes are built and reinforced by the repetition of those stereotypes in the media. So through working with librarians and archivists, journalists and academics can use history to test media cultivation theory and to provide context to articles about deep issues in current affairs. Dr. Carter-Olson has had her students trace a stereotype through the media using historical databases and university archives for 3 years now. And through the project, students have found that even seemingly innocuous stereotypes, like the math genius South Asian male is an example that she gave, have been weaponized through being used in a variety of media sources, from old newspapers, books, and even yearbooks to today's movies and TV shows. Adding historical context to reporting on race, gender, sexuality, disability, class, and other differences allows reporters to tell richer stories that extend beyond the surface headlines to reveal the deeper cultural resonance in stories about discrimination and difference in our culture. And another of our panelists, Dr. Carly Goodman at LaSalle University, I mentioned that she was the editor of the Washington Post Made by History feature. What she strives to do is to make historical complexity accessible to general readers. Made by History in the Washington Post provides rigorous historical analysis of US current events and public debates in an easily digestible format. Made by History pieces provide context and clarity to today's headlines through carefully researched and edited articles written by a diverse group of scholars. As Dr. Goodman explained, these stories help make scholarly history accessible to journalists, to non-specialist readers, and to students. And in this way, Dr. Goodman disseminates historical thinking and method, and not just the lessons of history. More broadly, she helps to train scholars to write with different audiences and goals in mind than the typical scholarly audiences that they try to write for. She offered advice on how to write for Made in History and columns like it. And her work is similar in many respects to what Dr. Hart will talk about next. And that is the challenges of writing as a historian for general interest journalism outlets. So I'm going to turn the floor back over to you now, Dr. Hart.
And classic muted myself. Thanks so much. So yeah, I mean, you know, we have an increasingly wide range of outlets now for historians to write in the public. Of course, The Conversation, which is a broader scholarly outlet that tries to provide this kind of connection. Something like Made by History. There's academic blogs that are intended to be accessible, like Nursing Clio or the African American Intellectual History Society. There's many others, right? And some of the things that I write for are included in that category. So the issues that Carly mentioned are things that I've experienced directly, right? So I've actually written for Made by History and in the Washington Post, and had Carly as my editor, and so she and I worked through some of these issues together. And I was not new to writing for public audiences, but I will say, writing for a national news publication that is explicitly journalistic and in a kind of traditional sense, not the kind of newer blogish informed public sites, was interesting and a challenge. So there's always this gap, and we talk a lot about this in history communication and trying to train students to do this work. There's a gap between the kind of complexity and detail and kind of, you know, nuanced arguments of significance that we privilege in traditional scholarship, traditional academic scholarship and research, and the way that news sites generally prefer for writing to look and sound in order to be accessible for a general audience, and also to pitch to a level of understanding for a general audience, right? So when we write academic scholarship, we're often writing to our peers and other people who are knowledgeable about a field. When we write for a general audience, we can't assume as much, right? We're all maybe increasingly aware in this moment about the sorrowful state of history and civics education in the United States, and just how little people actually know based on a K-12 education and maybe one course in college. And so, you know, thinking about that is really important. Audience and a kind of profound lack of education of the general public is a challenge. And so this, I was talking to Michael yesterday about how this exact issue has really been at the core of my frustration, particularly this summer, as I've tried to get, and successfully ultimately did, but was trying to place several stories about kind of COVID in Africa, and thinking about the history of pandemic and putting kind of the history of disease and public health responses in global and historical perspective. And to me, you know, a core argument in my work is that these things, understanding the global history of these things and their imperial legacies or their imperial roots is really critical. Stuff like public health, fields like public health and other related fields, including engineering and other things, became professionalized through empire, and they still hold those legacies in terms of their in terms of the kind of scholarly or the kind of professional and kind of practice oriented assumptions that they make about the way the world works and what intervention looks like, and why intervention is important, and the degree to which or kind of how you go about developing interventions. And so, you know, it seemed important in that moment to say, hold on, right? As we're all thinking about, you know, rebuilding our cities and reorganizing our spaces and, you know, engaging people in public health conversations and changing technology, that we should stop and take a minute and understand where our assumptions come from in those fields, that there are assumptions in those fields, and think reflectively about whether that is what we want in the future, or whether we're just going to reproduce the violence of the past. And that seemed like a compelling argument to me. Other people had written related things, and we quoted and cited and linked to those. And I spoke to the editor, the global editor for the conversation, and she said, this sounds really great. Our audience isn't interested. And I said, well, she said, they don't know anything about Africa. The Africa stories don't get picked up. I wouldn't want to publish it and you feel bad and not get any, you know, not get any readers. We just don't run it on our US site. And I said, well, you know, it seems to me it's a bit of a chicken and the egg sort of situation, right? So, you know, if readers aren't interested or engaged in African topics or non-US topics generally, if they have a lack of ability to engage outside of a relatively narrow set of issues that dominate the news, then who produced that, right? And to what degree do we need to continue to reproduce it? At what point do we stop the cycle and say we're gonna change things? And that was a really hard argument to make. She wasn't ready for that, right? She said, I understand what you're saying. I just don't know what to do about it, right? She wasn't ready. Carly, however, was, right? So Carly Goodman, as Michael was mentioning, is a historian. She, a practicing historian. She has her PhD, and she works on US related issues, but she also works on African history. And so Carly approached me about writing something and really pushed her other colleagues, her US history colleagues, and fellow editors to ensure that this piece, as well as other pieces that came after it, that had a non-US focus, were included in the coverage of Made by History. And she's not alone in that. There's other people advocating for that, and most prominently at the Washington Post, Karen Etia, who's the global opinions editor herself, has an African studies background. She and I were Fulbrighters together in Ghana, and she has spoken out really prominently about that too, right? The degree to which the assumptions that are brought to the news by editors, by journalists, by whatever, that all of us carry, right? They're not alone in that, but all of us carry those assumptions. To what degree is that limiting the kinds of coverage that's happening? And that's a major issue. The other major issue that has gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years is questions about citation and credit. Including historians that are connected to Wayne. If a journalist uses heavily, or a writer of some sort relies heavily on the published work of a historian, an academic historian, but doesn't recognize them in the writing, doesn't cite their work, doesn't give them credit, then what is that? And so that those kinds of issues about kind of permission and recognition and giving, the politics of citation, which is really important in academia, but also increasingly important broadly, what's going on there and what might we be able to do about it? Because at one point, it was causing such a huge friction between historians and journalists that people just stopped engaging altogether. I mean, there was a kind of breakdown in communication. It seems to have gotten to a better place now, but for a while it was really a big, profound challenge. And so one of the things that we've thought about a lot is, and it's has to be core to this project, right, is thinking through those issues, sitting down together, people who are editors and writers and academics, and talking about in a genuine way, right? Not in a defensive way, but in a productive, genuine way, what those concerns are, and thinking together about how we might address them. And so coming out with white papers and sharing those with professional associations, trying to come up with best practices and establishing relationships that we can carry forward and support, and then hopefully serve as models for other kinds of arrangements elsewhere in the country. I think Michael has some examples that are really interesting to reflect on in that regard.
All right, so I'll take the baton from you here again. Thank you. And I'm going to share screen again now and go back to the slides. So the killing of George Floyd last year and the uprisings against police violence last summer occurred in the middle of a moment of reckoning for two major American newspapers, and those are the Los Angeles Times and the Kansas City Star. And both of these did far-reaching examinations of their own histories of dealing with race going back to the late 19th century. And they concluded that they needed to own up to their pasts. So they published what they found, and they took the extraordinary step of publishing front-page apologies. I'm going to let the Times' own video explain their project to you. So let me just hit this link here. Oh, where are we? Hyperlink. Oops. What did I do?
It's the next slide.
It's the next slide. There we go. There we go. There we go. I thought we had a thing for open the link right from the slides, but I'm going to just stop the share and go over to my browser. Then. Get that loaded.
You're still
Marauders.
Whoops. Wait a minute. Back to the screen share. All right, here we go.
That's what a headline in the Los Angeles Times called a supposed underclass of criminals who left their South LA homes to terrorize white people in LA's suburbs. That kind of fear-mongering and racism appeared on the front page of the Times in July 1981. That incident opens an extraordinary article looking back at the Times' history, taking stock of its past failures, and apologizing for them.
There's a lot of rawness and a lot of anger, and it's justified.
In those pages of the LA Times over, 140 years almost at this point, you see the total highs and the lows of American journalism and Latinos.
It's a rough time dealing with this in a pandemic. Could not be a worse scenario for dealing with the rawness of race relations and the volatility of the issue.
Accompanied by personal essays by journalists, the Times takes an unflinching look at its pages and inside the newsroom to examine where it failed readers, where it made progress, and where it still must go. This was a paper that for its first 80 years embraced white supremacy. It supported wartime incarceration of the Japanese. It dismissed attacks in 1943 on young Mexican Americans by wartime soldiers on leave in downtown LA as the fault of the victims, not the attackers. For years, the newsroom was a sea of white men.
You have to think this is 1880s Los Angeles when the paper starts. Mexican, they're still being referred to by an epithet, greasers. It was the worst epithet you could call a Mexican. And what the LA Times was doing was defining what is a greaser. Basically saying anyone, any Mexican who's of mixed race, Native American and white or black and white, they were a subspecies. They were subhuman, basically. There was that headline. There was, of course, the headlines during the Zoot Suit riots where the LA Times was applauding sailors and Marines beating up Mexican-American youth who were dressed in these Zoot suits and saying, they showed them a lesson. The worst in many ways was the editorial cartoons during the Mexican Revolution. Big lips, dark skin, just always looking menacing, like ready to conquer and kill white people. And there was a vested interest with the Los Angeles Times because the Chandler family that owned the Times, they owned millions of acres in land in Mexico. So they didn't want no Mexicans to be revolting for a better life for themselves if that was going to imperil their land holdings.
When civil unrest erupted in Watts in 1965, the paper pressed into service a young black advertising messenger to help cover the turmoil in the streets. He was made a reporter trainee, but left the next year. And 27 years after Watts, when the acquittal of 4 police officers in the beating of motorist Rodney King sparked an uprising in the streets, the paper found itself again desperately searching for black reporters. There were more black reporters on staff by then, but many were relegated to the distant bureaus of the paper, far from the downtown newsroom.
I was working in the San Fernando Valley section at the time. I remember watching everything that was happening on televisions out there, and I had no idea I was going to be involved. The newsroom was in chaos. There were people running around, and the city desk quickly assigned me to go out with another reporter to some of the hot spots in the city and try to report what was going on.
But at the same time, he knew he was cannon fodder, as one black journalist bitterly called it, on those dangerous streets.
Metro did not have a whole lot of black reporters, and a lot of the white reporters who were usually covering those kinds of things were afraid to go out into the streets. So editors felt that it would be a lot safer for the African-American reporters to go out and cover what was going on. After the dust calmed down a little, there were some editors, Linda Williams and some reporters who noticed that there were all of a sudden a whole lot of black bylines on the front page and on the front page of Metro that usually weren't there. Black reporters weren't a usual part of Metro, but then during a crisis situation, all of a sudden we were of great value. And that just ratcheted up a lot of tensions, and it just kind of uncovered, I think, a boiling pot in the newsroom about how non-diverse the Times main sections were in terms of having people of color.
The paper has dramatically evolved since that headline, reducing Black and brown people to marauders. A landmark series about Latinos and how they were reshaping Southern California was written by Latino journalists and earned the paper a Pulitzer Prize for public service in 1984.
Many of the Latinos on staff created this 28-part series, but within 10 years, almost all of them were gone. They felt frustrated by the management of the Los Angeles Times, who felt that management treated them as tokens and wouldn't allow them for advancement in the paper itself.
Yet, over the last 4 decades, the number of journalists of color has fluctuated erratically. The paper swung from having 3 Black journalists on the masthead in the early 2000s and 2 Latino journalists on the masthead at different times during that first decade to having only 1 Black staff reporter on the paper's largest section, Metro, just in the past few years. Today, 38% of the staff are people of color, still not high enough in a region as diverse as Southern California.
To improve coverage of communities of color, the Los Angeles Times just has to be a more diverse paper. I still think about 65% of the paper is white, and that's not necessarily a problem. But if those editors do not have that nuances of the communities of color here, if they're not paying attention to what's going on with groups, with individuals, then we're not going to get any further.
Anger and rawness and emotion is great. It's needed. It's warranted. But it can also drain a person. And so you also have to really be reflective and be cognizant of the humanity behind all these emotions. And only then, I think, can you reach a point where there can start to be a coming together, a healing, a unity where we really reach some understanding. And it's only that understanding that's going to move us past this point.
Even as the paper has sought over the years to cover diverse communities, it has yet to fully portray the complexity and depth of Latino, Black, and Asian lives and other people of color in California. That is a work in progress.
We have a special moment to be able to diversify our staff, diversify our coverage, not be the paper of the past that had all these sins, but the paper of today, which is an exciting paper, a paper where it's more diverse than ever before. Let's not blow this.
I'm cautiously optimistic. I would like to be more optimistic in the coming months to see that there really is meaningful progress.
On behalf of the institution, the Times apologizes for its history of racism. We owe it to our readers to do better, and we will do better.
Well, so that was the project of the Los Angeles Times, and what I think we see there is potentially what in agenda setting studies in communication and mass communication we call a focusing event, and that is something that sets off perhaps a chain reaction of other similar projects in major American media. The Kansas City Star, a couple of months after the Times's project was published, this was in December last year, they did an extraordinary I think 6 or 7 full pages inside their December 20th edition, which was introduced with a front page apology. And I just want to read to you the beginning of that apology. This was by Kansas City Star executive editor Mike Fannin. Today we are telling the story of a powerful local business. For 140 years, it has been one of the most influential forces in shaping Kansas City and the region. And yet, for much of its early history, through sins of both commission and omission, it disenfranchised, ignored, and scorned generations of Black Kansas Cityans. It reinforced Jim Crow laws and redlining. Decade after early decade, it robbed an entire community of opportunity, dignity, justice, and recognition. That business is the Kansas City Star. Before I say more, I feel it to be my moral obligation to express what is in the hearts and minds of the leadership and staff of an organization that is nearly as old as the city it loves and covers. We are sorry. And this special edition went on to tell stories of major Kansas City stories, a disastrous flood in September of 1978 that everybody called the Plaza Flood. But what they ignored by giving it that label and focusing on affluent areas and suburbs was they ignored the widespread devastation in the black part of town east of Troost Avenue in Kansas City. They ignored the major contributions of Black musicians and artists to American culture in the 18th Street and Vine Jazz District. If you wanted to read about Black people in Kansas City, you had to read the African-American newspaper, the Kansas City Call. So this is, it's heartening to see the Star owning up to its past. We'll see if it does better. I want to turn our attention now and our focus in the Q&A to what reckonings might be necessary in Detroit media. In 2001, the Free Press's executive editor wrote a column in which he said, it is better to fight racial injustice now than it is to focus on the past. And in fact, the Free Press, since the Knight Company bought the Free Press in the 1940s, has been very progressive compared to other newspapers in the Midwest. However, if you look before that, you see similar patterns of discriminatory coverage to what the LA Times discovered about itself. So I want to open the floor for the Q&A now and leave you with that question of what reckonings do Detroit media need to go about, and how can historians contribute to that? So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, everybody.
If you have questions for Professors Fuhlhage and Hart, either raise your hands or unmute yourself and jump in, and they can also manage the questions as they see fit.
Hello, professors. My name is Lindsay Matson, and I'm actually a Spanish master's student here at Wayne State. So this topic has actually been very interesting today. I'm attending this Brown Bags meeting because I'm taking a literary theory course, and so I'm going to be posting about this. And so I'm actually finishing my master's degree in Spanish this semester, and I'm working as a GTA as well, which has been really exciting. So the topic about racism against Latinos in Southern California was really interesting to me, and I've been possibly thinking about pursuing my PhD in the future. I'm very interested in Florida and Miami and Caribbean studies as well. So I was just wondering if you know of any similar issues in the media, maybe in Southeast United States compared to Southwest or anything like that, or maybe in New York or other areas where there's a large Latino population.
Oh, wow. I would love to handle that question.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for that question, Lindsay. So the first thing that I would suggest to you, and this was originally going to be my dissertation topic at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And what I did for my master's thesis was to examine how the Garden City Telegram in Southwest Kansas adjusted to a massive influx of mostly Mexican and Mexican-American meatpacking workers when they built the world's largest meatpacking plant.
Wow.
And, you know, it's a tricky topic because there are issues of journalism studies and communication studies, as well as managerial theory and organizational theory that come into play. How does an organization recognize that change is going on around it, and how does it respond to it once it recognizes that change is going on around them? So what I was originally going to do was to take the model from that master's thesis and expand it into the American Southeast. In, I think, between 2005 and 2008, demographers started talking about a phenomenon called the New Latino South.
Mhm.
And that is largely a phenomenon of immigrant labor moving into work in turkey and pork and chicken processing plants, as well as to work in a construction boom that was going on in places like Charlotte, North Carolina, the suburbs of Atlanta, those sorts of places. That would be really ripe for looking at how news organizations respond to that kind of demographic change, and what kind of representation do they offer to these immigrant newcomers into the communities. How do they embrace them? How do they portray the community pushing them away? And in what ways do they mediate that? So those are some thoughts for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're welcome to do a whole dissertation on that. I'm not going to be picking that up again. I like it here in Detroit.
Yeah. They're just gathering all these ideas, and it's so interesting to hear people from different, disciplines talking about something that I'm studying on. So another quick question I have is, was there any particular reason why you decided to study Latinos? Do you have like a background in it? Did you study Spanish in school, or?
My mom's Mexican American, so
Okay.
that's a substantial part of it. Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. Thank you
But
so much.
in my previous career, I worked at newspapers in the borderlands too. So Palm Springs, California, and Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Was a lot more about the like nitty gritty of all that, but I'm also from a rural community in the South, and I can say that those areas have been severely understudied in terms of this demographic shift, and in those areas there's like almost no mention or integration of Latino communities in many of these areas, and no recognition of them in local news, and so actually I think that actually is a lot more interesting than looking at Miami, for example, where I mean there's been a lot of conversation for a long time, but big urban centers, there's a push, there's a sizable kind of public presence of these communities, and they often push back. Whether it's successful or not is a different question, but it is a public conversation, whereas in rural areas that is often not the case, and that's not something that people have talked about very much.
When you say rural areas, do you mean like bordering states like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas?
No, in the Southeast.
Oh, in the Southeast, sorry.
Yeah. So I'm from Kentucky, but in Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, all over the Southeast. It's a major issue in rural areas.
Yeah, I bet. Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
Jerry has a question.
I do. Thanks for two fine linked presentations, first of all. And then I have a question that's kind of about politics, given the fact that there's much good work here to be done. There are probably more people producing more text than at any time in the history of our republic. It's like, here's the desire for text, the desire to participate in public discourse. Here are the agents where that could happen. That's where it seems to me this becomes a political question. Where do you think the impetus for the good work you're describing, where might that come from, and how might that be cultivated to see that this good work does in fact get done?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I can think about that a little bit. I do think that there is an increasing, from the academic side, but I also think from journalists, honestly, an increasing conversation about like the value of higher education and the value of scholarship and research. And I think that, for academics, the imperative to write for the public is higher than ever before. There's still definitely people who are doing kind of traditional academic scholarship, however you want to define that. But there are increasing numbers of people, whether it's the sole kind of focus of what they do, or it's a part of what they do, like me, and you do that translation work. There's a lot of that application, and a lot of it is driven by this idea that, like we haven't explained our relevance, right? We haven't shown how we're relevant to people, or we've forgotten how to do that sometimes. And so thinking about that in the classroom, so a lot of people are increasingly teaching these kinds of skills in the classroom. to students and helping them think practically about how you translate, academic knowledge and classroom knowledge into something that would apply and inform your daily life. But also writing in these public spheres. I think that there also has been, particularly around the issue of the 1619 project, but also more broadly, there's been big debates. Ta-Nehisi Coates also provoked a lot of these many years before the 1619 project. Really pushing people to think about, the responsibilities, but also the limits of journalism. And the more that journalists or people writing in a journalistic style or for journalistic publications have been stepping out and doing more of that kind of academic informed, writing and work, I think the more they found that it can be really tricky, right? And so like, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's wonderful in all sorts of ways and incorporated scholars into the 1619 project, has found herself subject to a lot of criticism and people saying, well, this thing that you said is provocative for the news, but it's not nuanced enough or accurate enough, and it doesn't, right? And so those sorts of challenges I think are real. And I think that, news organizations and academics both have a desire to be part of these public conversations and to help shape them, and are both finding that they're facing challenges and in various different ways. And we're starting to see some examples. So like the examples that Michael cited, I mentioned him yesterday, the Smithsonian, or not the Smithsonian, the National Geographic had done a similar thing with their photographs. There's a number of initiatives. We're starting to see that collaboration happen a little more. And I think, from the academic side, that it really increasingly universities are going to have to be proactive in the way. I mean, we're starting to see some of it in terms of like their public histories and the histories of slavery in places like Brown, for example, or Johns Hopkins, and these big projects that are public facing. But I think also universities are going to have to start promoting and supporting the training of public scholars in various ways. Whether that's like a history communication program like we have. John Corvino and I have been working on the idea of a Center for Public Scholarship. What does that look like? I think there's many models, but I think that the politics that you mentioned, right? There's just these examples that have been so provocative in recent years that it's forcing people to consider it, right?
Yeah, what I would add on to that is that the Associated Press Managing Editors Association has been struggling with the problem of first who is diversity. They did newsroom censuses and discovered just the kind of stats that the LA Times discovered, that they had very low numbers of people of color, and certainly not representative of the demographics of their readership areas. So the first stage was to try to include or try to increase diversity. Going beyond that is the question of not just diversity but inclusivity, including these newcomers to the newsroom from populations of people of color in the decision making that goes on in the newsroom. What I think we're starting to see is a third stage of building on that, which is empowerment and amplification in the form of, all right, you've helped us make the decisions. Now we're going to hand you the microphone and let you do the talking. And all of this, wow, I mean, if you want to drill way back into motivations for what might be behind this, is perhaps there's a recognition that in addition to needing to serve the entire community, you can do good business as well by doing good, by showing folks in the community that you are listening to them and you are asking about their issues. So maybe in a capitalist-based publication system, there could be some profit motive that is involved in this. I want it for all to be, because at our heart, we're good people, but good people got to eat too.
Yeah.
Jade, you've got a hand up?
Question, yeah.
Yeah, I do. And it piggybacks on that. How can projects like the one that you're doing, because when you hand people the microphone, you're like, oh, it's your time. You can say what you want. You have to pay them for that labor, right? Like you can't just exploit them for their stories to then make money off of that. That's no better than the situation we already have. And with the problem of the way that newspapers are underfunded, the fact that they can't hold staff as well, local newspapers are really going by the wayside. Everyone's getting their information, their news from Reddit. Where do projects at the university which attempt to do this translational work come in to resolve that conflict?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to the kinds of things that we had started to think through with the Center for Public Scholarship idea, which is, the universities have the capacity to create structures and collect and generate donations to support systems and support community storytellers, right? So built into the idea of the kind of Center for Public Scholarship that we've been talking about was, not only training for faculty and students, but also places for community storytellers, and they got stipends, right? They got money and resources and support, technical support, and direct connection with scholars and journalists, right? So we were, and I talk about this a lot at Wayne, like the university should be the place that people can come to get resources and support to achieve their goals. Whatever that might be, and we should help facilitate them being compensated for doing that, right? Both students and faculty and community members. And I think we have the resources to do that, and we should be leveraging that in our community connections, because we already are a place that people look to, right? We should be leveraging that in important ways. I think not all of the projects have been intentional in thinking about that exist kind of in the world. But I will say, I think some things, so related to African studies or the kind of representation of Africa in the media, there's been a popular hashtag for, I don't know, probably almost 10 years now, called the Africa the Media Doesn't Show You, that's been heavily critical of Western and generally global media coverage of the continent, and has pushed back and provided, images and counter narratives, but also, really been the impetus. So that kind of public and community generated, not funded, not compensated movement did push the Associated Press and other major outlets to start hiring more African photographers. And their photos are now being picked up on the Associated Press wire and other places, and likewise, African journalists representing and writing about what's happening on the continent. So I do think that it's always a chicken and the egg thing, right? Like community support that might be unfunded is often necessary to produce change that does result in professionals being compensated for their work. But I think the university absolutely should be trying to compensate people and support them with research.
And I have one more question. You talk about writing for the public, right? You go to these journalists and you and journalism work together. Have you considered that people can't access that because those articles are behind paywalls? How do you overcome the fact that, just like with academic papers, people can't publicly access them, so they don't know, they can't read it. Lots of journalism is not publicly available to people. They're behind paywalls that folks don't want.
Yeah, and
you can negotiate dual publication for one.
Yeah, I mean, there's
published behind the paywall, gets published publicly as well.
Yeah, there's options. You can put stuff. You can put stuff out. I recently published something in the Detroit News that I couldn't even access, like the university, like whatever. They didn't even give me a free link for myself, and so there's archiving systems that put it out there, and then I put the Google Doc out into the world. But yeah, I do think that when we talk about public scholarship, we have to talk broadly about the various kinds of forms of what that looks like. So that includes blog writing, that includes social media engagement, that includes, a broad range of things. And when we train students in history communication, that is, and likewise with science communication, right? We really think broadly about what that means, so that people aren't just writing op-eds. Because you're right, it is like a narrow field. And there, there's podcasting, there's interviews on the radio, public radio in particular. I think there's lots of options. People doing increasing numbers of like documentary films, for example, or being experts on documentary films. There's a lot of stuff that's possible, and I think we have to think broadly about that if we're going to talk about accessibility. Sometimes the op-eds get attention because that's the thing that like marketing will pick up and share, but that's not the Chris has a question. Chris Darpo.
I'm unmuting myself. Thanks you guys. This was really provocative and hit too many places of my past lives, but in good ways, I suppose. Though I must say I share Greg Braxton's incredulity that anything will really change at the Times. But to my point, your conversation today, and Jennifer in particular, this discussion of what universities can do and the work that you're doing at Wayne to create places for discussing and educating around publicly engaged scholarship and the role of the university in collaboration with community. I'm thinking about labor schools as a model, and how effective they've been at bringing, for many, many years, bringing workers, right? And creating opportunities for workers in universities with access to university resources. And it occurs to me that something like that on this topic would allow an even broader reach by not just bringing scholars and journalists together, because to my mind, journalists usually aren't the problem, it's the editors and the owners, right? So the university could facilitate more in-depth conversations within the journalism community of like-minded people who want to see change in their publications and in their shops.
Yeah,
so,
that's exactly right. I mean, I think, the thing that Michael and I have proposed as a first step is exactly that, right? And then thinking more broadly about how we build on that and what that looks like, I think has to include the kinds of things that you're mentioning. I think that the university and lots of universities have increasingly started moving in that direction. I think it's in particular imperative for a university like Wayne to think really carefully about that.
All right. If there are no other questions,
okay, no, sorry.
If there are no other questions, then let us thank Jennifer and Michael for an excellent presentation. The talk was recorded, and if Jennifer and Michael give us permission, we will post it on our website, which ultimately ends up on YouTube, for you to review the information and get back to Jennifer and Michael with further questions. I know them both, and they are people who are very willing to engage and to provide answers and solutions and participation. They're very engaged scholars, so I know that you'll be able to further engage them. So thank you all. The Humanity Center gives its speakers small gifts, and this year we have a mask and a journal with our logo on it. we can't give it to you now because of the COVID restrictions, but as soon as we get back on campus, we will make sure that you get those small tokens of our appreciation. So if either of you or both of you would like to give any closing remarks, you have the floor. If not, thank you all.
I just want to say thank you for the platform. This was a real pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. All right. So, okay, bye-bye now.